Hey y'all, Dave here. Welcome to my main channel where I mostly discuss philosophy and atheism, along with some skepticism sometimes. In this video, we're going to be discussing all three. Or more specifically, we're gonna be continuing our response to Cameron Bertuzzi's recent video asking about miracles. This time looking at the second question that he posed here.
Number two is, if we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists? And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened.
So in this one, we're going to look at the qualifications an event must possess in order to be considered a miracle, along with some events that are officially considered to be miracles by the Catholic Church. We'll focus on two of those events, the miracle of the sun from 1917 and the Therese Newman case, along with looking at an argument for why the events listed in the Bible can't count as verification for the miracles of Jesus, while also looking at things like testimony as evidence and some other ideas. Anyway, that's enough of an introduction. Let's get on with it. Cameron asks us here whether a verified miracle would give us a reason to believe that God exists.
If we could verify that some miracle actually occurred, would that give us a reason to think that God exists?
He explicitly states that it would be contingent on us being able to verify that a miracle occurred.
And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened.
Of course, the simple and short answer here is sure. Of course it would give us a reason to believe that God exists.
Yes. Absolutely, I do indeed concur wholeheartedly.
As I stated in the shorter video on the topic though, the problem is that we could never verify that a miracle occurred.
That can't be done.
So if we can never verify that a miracle occurred, and it being a reason to believe God exists is contingent on verification, then a miracle can never give us reason to believe that God exists.
Say what?
Of course, it's a little more complicated than that. As explained in the first part of this video series, when discussing evidence, there is a subjective nature to it, just as there is a subjective nature to what would count as verification of a miracle. We'll come back to that later on at some point, but for now, let me explain why a miracle can never be verified. We'll start first by exploring what a miracle is. When it comes to defining what a miracle is, I tend to lean towards David Hume's definition. Hume defines a miracle as a violation of natural laws. There are a vast number of miracle claims out there, millions throughout history according to Capturing Christianity.
Millions of miracle reports throughout history.
The problem with saying there are millions of miracle claims out there is that it seems to set a scene where miracles are actually kind of commonplace. I mean, let's look at this for a moment. Recorded history is about 5,000 years old. And taking that figure is actually being kind of generous, because that's going back to the very beginning with the Sumerians and cuneiform writing. If we take the start of Judaism, then we're left with about 3,500 years, and with Christianity, we're left with about 2,000 years. So in order to be very generous here, we'll go with the 5,000 years figure. If we convert that 5,000 years into days, we have around 1,825,000 days. Now, Cameron claims that there are millions of miracle claims throughout history.
Millions of miracle reports throughout history.
Which means that if we're to take all those miracle claims as genuine miracles, then it turns out to be one miracle every couple of days.
Yeah, these are not rare at all.
Meaning that miracles aren't really anything special, as they happen all the time. Or at least people claim they happen all the time anyway, something we'll talk about later. Thankfully though, the Catholic Church is a little more conservative when it comes to miracle claims. When we look at the site Catholic World Mission, it gives us standards for what counts as a miracle according to Catholic doctrine. Let's bring them up on screen here. The first condition that an event must meet in order to be considered a miracle is that it must be directly attributable to God and God only. Anything that can be attributed to nature or man cannot be considered a miracle. The next two can be combined into something like the event being beyond all natural laws, or a breaking of natural laws. Not even working through the natural laws, but a complete breaking of the natural laws. Something like someone coming back from the dead, for example. Or, as stated here, a fever leaving a body upon command or prayer. The event must be extraordinary, and it must be perceptible to the senses. Essentially, what we have here is something like Hume's claim that a miracle is a violation of natural laws, with some extra conditions, of course. To quote the site directly, the Catechism of the Catholic Church defines a miracle as a sign of wonder beyond nature's control that can only be attributed to God or divine intercession. Something to remember for later on. The Catholic Mission site lists several official miracles that are recognized by the Catholic Church. Among these are the 1917 Miracle of the Sun, the Star of Bethlehem, Our Lady of the Lourdes and the Healing Water, Therese Newman's Stigmata, the Prophecies of St. Malachi, Our Lady of Zaytun, as well as the 7 miracles of Jesus that are listed in the Bible, along with 70 official miracles of healings from Lourdes. That seems to be a lot less than the millions of miracle claims throughout history that Cameron mentions.
Millions of miracle reports throughout history.
With one quick investigation, we've cut that number down to a fraction of the number of claims that need to be investigated.
Oh, nice one!
Along with figuring out what qualifies something as a miracle.
Yeah, nice one, bub, yeah.
The Catholic definition somewhat resembles Hume's own definition of a miracle being a violation of the natural order, along with the extra qualification that it must be attributable to God and God only. So now that we have a basic understanding of miracles, and from the last video proportioning our beliefs to the evidence, I guess the next step is to look at verifying miracles. After all, Cameron makes it pretty clear that them being reason to believe God exists is contingent on the miracle being verified.
And again, this is contingent on whether or not we can actually verify that the miracle happened.
And it's here where we start to realize that things are on very shaky ground. Like, how exactly would we go about verifying that a miracle had occurred? Let's break things down a little here first. We can separate these investigations out a little bit. There are past miracle claims, current miracle claims, and future miracle claims. When we look at the Catholic World Mission site, we see that the officially listed miracles are mostly listed in a historical sense. It is claimed that miracles are still happening with regards to the healing waters at Lourdes, which is something I'll discuss in the next video when I discuss current miracles and future miracles. However, for the moment, let's stick with past miracles. There are a few problems when it comes to investigating and verifying past miracles. The major one being that we have no access to the events themselves. Those events have been and gone, and what we are left with is the testimony and reports of all those involved, which causes several problems when it comes to verification. Think back to the previous video, where I discussed our experiences counting as evidence. We talked about someone claiming to be able to jump 20 feet in the air from a standing position. Our response to someone in that situation would be, prove it.
Can you prove it, cabrón?
Expecting some kind of demonstration as the proof. As soon as it was demonstrated, we would accept that as proof, though probably after some initial shock, skepticism, and investigation, of course. Let's keep to that example here, though change it up a little bit. Imagine rather than someone telling you they could do it, that it was someone telling you that someone they know can do it. How would you react? I'm sure there would be a certain amount of skepticism going on from you. I know there would be from me at least.
And I'll be honest, when I first heard about this tool, I was a little bit skeptical.
Just as with the case of the person telling us they could do it, it goes against all of our experiences of the world.
You are absolutely correct. I am going against everything that I believe in.
We set the probability of the event being relayed being true to 0 because of that fact, or at least at the most minimal amount of probability possible in our minds.
So you're telling me there's a chance?
It sets an incredibly high bar for our belief to jump over, so to speak. Now, what if we change the scenario slightly again? Let's say that the person telling us this thing is someone that we know really well. We know that this person is incredibly trustworthy and isn't prone to telling tall tales. That would change things for us, wouldn't it? I know it would for me, at least a little bit. I still wouldn't believe that person without some skepticism going on, but it would at least pique my interest somewhat. After all, it sounds like an incredible thing, and incredible things are very interesting to me. My sense of disbelief and my sense of curiosity would marry up and make me want to investigate it. If it was a stranger telling me this, though, then the same probably wouldn't happen. I think they were trying to pull my leg, or trying to see how gullible I was.
Pull the other one.
And you would probably feel the same, especially if the stranger was some drunk guy in the pub who was a tiny bit pissed. Testimony is kind of like that. Just as with empirical evidence and experiences, we proportion our beliefs to it depending on several factors. If the event being relayed is one that we see as something everyday and mundane, we generally don't question it. Like if we ask someone the time in the street and they tell us something that feels right, then we accept that's the time. However, if they were to respond that it was 3 a.m. when it was clearly mid-afternoon, we would probably think they were a bit strange, trying to play a trick, or at the very least need to set the time on their watch correctly. Like just mentioned, who is giving the testimony also makes a difference. We give slightly more weight to the testimony of someone we know than we do someone we don't know. Though the reputation of that person we know will also play a part too. If we know the person is honest, then we give the testimony more weight than we do someone who is a habitual liar. Even if they were relaying something everyday and mundane, we might even have pangs of doubt when it comes to someone we know is a habitual liar. It's still more complicated than that too, of course. Let's go back to the scenario of our trustworthy friend telling us about the extraordinary jumping person. Like I said, my interest would certainly be piqued if a close friend told me they knew someone like that. I wouldn't take their word as proof that someone could do it because of the whole going against all my experiences thing. But it would definitely count as evidence for me. It would raise the probability that it was true, even if only by a very small amount. If my friend introduced me to the extraordinary jumping person and I saw the person jump in an extraordinary way, then that would be proof. Then its strength as evidence would lower quite a bit, and I would become incredibly skeptical again. How skeptical I would be would depend on how well I know said cousin, and the strength of my belief would be proportioned by the same. The cycle I just mentioned would continue with the cousin. If the cousin introduced me to the jumping person and I saw it happen, then I would count that as proof. But if my friend said something like, well, I don't actually know him, it was my cousin that told me about him, and my cousin said he saw him do it. If the cousin said he saw the guy do it, and I knew the cousin, then how I proportion the strength of my belief would depend on the factors that we just talked about. If the cousin introduced me to his group of friends, and they all said that they saw it too, then that would strengthen it as evidence, but it still wouldn't really count as proof. At least not to me anyway, because as mentioned earlier, it goes against everything I know about the world. It might make me believe that they saw someone do the jump, but I would most likely think they were deceived by some trickery. After all, I have more evidence of trickery and deception than I do people jumping like that. I've seen people doing jumps like that using trickery, so that is how my belief would be proportioned. So I could go on telling this story about testimony and how throwing in different factors changes the weight and nature of the testimony, but I'm sure you all get the picture being painted and already understand that. Like David Hume says, testimony is an important form of evidence, but it is still something that we proportion our beliefs to, just in a different way than we do something like empirical evidence and experiences. Who is saying it, how many are saying it, what's being said, contradictory accounts, whether it's extraordinary or mundane, whether they have reason to deceive, and much, much more count towards the kind of weight that we give to the testimony. Anyway, we'll come back to some of this in a bit, but let's keep going for now. Keeping all of this in mind, let's look at some of the past miracles listed by the Catholic Mission website, starting with the miracles of Jesus. Rather than tackle the miracles of Jesus one by one, we're going to look at the whole of them here. As previously mentioned, one of the problems with past miracles is that we don't actually have access to the miracles, and the miracles of Jesus in this case. All we have access to are what is given to us by the New Testament. In other words, all we have access to is the testimony given by the writers of the New Testament. If you're a Jesus mythicist, then nothing in the New Testament will count as evidence, let alone proof and verification of miracles. I'm not a mythicist though, and accept the claim that Jesus was based on a historical figure. Of course, the miracle and divinity claims are something a little bit different, but the idea that there was a man that the New Testament was based on is a pretty mundane claim as far as I'm concerned. And Tim O'Neill of History for Atheists, along with Jordan and Jared from Reason to Doubt, make some great arguments as far as the existence of Jesus goes. I'll leave a link to the channels in the description for anyone wanting to look. Let's move on with the argument from testimony for now though. Let's consider the idea of the extraordinary jumping person here again for a moment. It goes against all my experiences of how the world works and how humans work. But I can kind of conceive of how some person might be able to do it. It's incredibly unlikely, but I can paint a story in my head of someone exercising every day, practicing jumping every day, and that kind of thing. I can even look at some of the feats of athletes and sort of conceive of a person doing it. As someone in the chat of the premiere of the first video of this series said, they can imagine a person being able to do this jump on the moon. There are ways in which we can conceive of this jump happening. The greatest miracle of Jesus, that of coming back from the dead, is a different matter though. I cannot conceive of someone coming back from the dead, at least not dead anyway. There are ways I can conceive of people coming back from the dead. If anyone's familiar with the film The Serpent and the Rainbow, it is about Haitian zombies. People being drugged into a state where they appear to be dead, and were even given funerals, but then were later seen walking around. But the account of Jesus coming back from the dead isn't this kind of coming back from the dead, it's the dead kind. Which means that this claim goes against all my experiences and everything I know about the natural order of the world, meaning that this claim already begins from a zero probability, just like the claim of someone jumping 20 feet in the air. And unlike asking the person to show me them jumping 20 feet in the air, I can't really ask Jesus to rise from the dead again. Instead, this case is more like someone in the pub telling me that they heard from their cousin that someone jumped 20 feet in the air. Although it's even worse than that. It's like someone in the pub telling me that someone else in another pub heard from someone else in another pub that heard it from someone else in another pub that read a story written by someone else in another pub that they heard from someone else in a city center about someone jumping 20 feet in the air. It starts from a place of me not being able to trust the testimony to begin with, and it's telling me about something I think is impossible. So, like I said, we're already starting on ground so shaky it could be at the epicenter of a continent-splitting earthquake. This is the kind of account we have when it comes to the Bible. It is already starting from the epicenter of an earthquake. We have no experiences of people being raised from the dead, except in cases where we are being deceived. Just as we have no experience with those who wrote the accounts, we have no way of determining their trustworthiness, meaning that we have no way of proportioning our beliefs to their trustworthiness, which in turn diminishes their trustworthiness considering the kinds of accounts they are giving. Just as with the story about the testimony concerning my friend telling me about the person that can jump 20 feet in the air, this one can keep going and going. The more we talk about the story of the testimony given in the Bible, the weaker it becomes not only as testimony but as verification. The contradictory nature of some of those reports weakens its strength as both evidence and testimony. Its literary nature weakens it, as does the nature of reporting miracle events. That we cannot question the witnesses weakens it. How distant it is in the past weakens it. As evidence and verification, it simply does not get off the ground without presupposing its reliability. But presupposing its reliability begs the question. If we assume it's true from the beginning, then we can call it verification. But what we're looking to do is verify it so that we can call it true. The only way for us to truly verify any of the miracles mentioned in the Bible is to have access to a time machine so we can have access to the events. Just as the only way to verify the person jumping 20 feet in the air is to have access to the person themselves. So none of the miracles listed in the Bible can count as evidence for God unless we presuppose the truth of them, which goes against the stipulation Cameron makes of miracle claims being contingent on their verification to count as reason to believe God exists. Proportioning our beliefs here would mean believing them to be most likely false. However, we do have more recent miracles that we can take a look at. Let's have a look at a couple of them. On screen now is the description of the 1917 Miracle of the Sun taken from the Catholic Mission's website. As you can see, it describes the Virgin Mary revealing herself to some children, with promises of miracles to come. There's a lot of info out there about this one, and lots of attempts to debunk it. People question the integrity and character of the children, and let's face it, there are problems with the reliability of the testimony of children. However, I'm gonna forego a lot of that and focus on something else here. If you're interested in looking, then there is a ton of info out there if you just Google 1917 Miracle of the Sun. I have to admit, there are some interesting details out there, but investigation leads me to proportion my belief to the fact that no miracle occurred here. That's not to say I'm denying what people saw, nor do I think it was a mass hallucination or delusion. I think the event actually occurred. There is lots of testimony out there, from believers and non-believers alike, describing the event as having occurred. So it would be kind of silly to deny that the event actually occurred. That isn't what I question here. What I question here is that an actual miracle occurred. Think back to the qualifications that an event must have in order for it to be a miracle. Two of those qualifications are that the event must be a suspension or breaking of natural laws, and that it can only be explained by God's intervention, and that's what I question here. Let's look first at the event being a suspension of the natural laws. If it is a suspension of the natural laws, then we would expect it not to be able to be explained by something like science. Yet, even the simplest of searches reveals a Guardian article discussing how it can be explained naturally using a meteorological explanation. As stated in the Guardian article, clouds of ice crystals at high altitude can create sundogs or false suns in bands of rainbow color, and sun dances may be a more complex variation of such effects. As stated by Arthur Vorowski in the same article, we have a fairly good 3D theoretical model of dynamic behavior in an electrically charged cloud. Though, as always in science, further explanation is needed. The event recorded in 1917 is also not the only time such an event has occurred. It's happened in various places across the globe. The events have even been recorded, like in this video here.
Ecco, la zia viene a vedere di nuovo. Zia, vieni a vedere. Sto qua. Aspetta.
Of course, the people that recorded the video declared it to be a miracle, and that's something I'll talk about at some point. But let's focus on the 1917 event for just a moment more. As we've just seen, the actual event itself can be explained by nature, and is not a suspension of the natural laws, meaning that it can't be considered a miracle according to the criteria of what makes something a miracle. However, there is still the prediction of the event by the children, which brought the gathering of people to witness the sun dancing. Maybe that's the miracle. Well, there are a couple problems with that one. The first one being that the event itself wasn't predicted by the children. All that was said was that on that day a miracle would occur. The event just happened to occur on that day while people were waiting for a miracle to happen. The event happened and people declared it to be a miracle. However, as we've just seen, the event doesn't meet the criteria for being classed as a miracle, which also means that the children's predictions cannot be considered either a miracle or a prediction of a miracle. If the children predicted a miracle would happen and no miracle happened, then the prediction was false, meaning that the prediction cannot be a breaking of the laws of nature or only explainable by God. It can easily be explained by people simply expecting to see a miracle and labeling a natural event as a miracle. In the expectation of seeing a miracle and wanting their faith affirmed, any event that day that was unusual would have been labeled a miracle. In this event, we can see a couple of things that Hume argues when it comes to miracles. The first is that when it comes to understanding the laws of nature, we are simply going on patterns that we see in the world with regularity. There is also much that we do not know about nature. So what is more likely? That some irregular event is simply us not having all the information about the natural world, or that some law of nature was actually suspended and broken. The fact that this event has happened more than once and that we have natural explanations for it seems to support Hume's idea here. Another thing that Hume asks is whether it is more likely that an actual suspension of the natural laws happened, or more likely that people were deceived by someone else or performed a kind of self-deception based on their desires. It seems to me here that the miracle of the sun is a case of both. Children made a vague prediction about a miracle happening on a particular day, and a natural event happened. People then deceived themselves by labeling said natural event a miracle. What actually happened is that the children's prediction didn't come true and no actual miracle happened. I haven't mentioned proportioning beliefs in this section, but I'll come back to that later in a kind of roundup fashion. We'll keep on the topic of deception for a little bit longer and discuss another miracle next. We'll discuss Therese Newman's stigmata, another official miracle according to the Catholic Mission site. What can be seen on screen here is the information about Therese Newman's stigmata taken from the Catholic Mission's website. As can be seen, Therese Newman was considered to be a stigmatic, funnily enough. What I'm about to mention is all taken from the Wikipedia article about her, and I'll provide a link to the article in the references. Therese Newman was partially paralyzed on the 11th of March 1918 during a fire in her uncle's barn. She suffered further falls after that and claimed to be partially blinded after one of them, and in 1919 claimed to be permanently blinded. According to her, her eyesight was restored in 1923 after the beatification of Therese of Lisieux. In 1925, she was diagnosed with appendicitis, and while being prepared for surgery, had violent convulsions and a religious experience. Therese then asked her family to go to church and pray for her, and then announced that she had been cured of the appendicitis. In 1926, she began to develop signs of stigmata. First, a wound above her heart appeared. Though she kept this wound quiet, she reported having a religious vision. A week later, she had another vision, and the wound above her heart reappeared. This time, she reported it to her sister. The visions continued, and the wounds kept reappearing every week. On the Good Friday of that year, she had a vision of the entire Passion of the Christ, and she showed wounds on her hands and feet, as well as developed blood coming from her eyes. These visions and wounds continued each year on Good Friday. Therese also claimed that from 1923 until her dying in 1962, the only food that she consumed was the Eucharist and did not drink any water during the same time. Of course, there is a lot more detail to it than that, and this is kind of a Cliff Notes version. Like I said though, the link to the wiki article will be in the references, and there's lots about it online. It's definitely an interesting case though, isn't it? I mean, surviving only on communion crackers for so long, that's gotta be a miracle, right? Only God could sustain her for so long, and only God could bring about the stigmata. Well, let's look at some of the details here. Let's start with the claim that Therese consumed only the Eucharist from 1923 until dying in 1962. The Eucharist consists of a sip of wine and a small bit of bread, and this is definitely not enough for someone to subsist on. The image on screen at the moment is taken from the 1988 book The Bleeding Mind, an investigation into the mysterious phenomena of stigmata by Ian Wilson. In this section, Wilson speaks about the monitoring of Newman while investigating her claim about living only off the Eucharist. As can be seen, when the monitoring began, Therese weighed in at 121 pounds and dropped to 112.5 pounds. So it was clear that while under strict observation, Therese lost weight. There was no magical sustaining going on. However, once the 24-hour observation stopped, she regained weight, making it pretty obvious that she was not existing only on the Eucharist, but was instead eating and drinking as normal. In his book, Wilson also discusses the investigations of the stigmata claims, so let's have a quick look at those too. What can be seen on screen at the moment is another screenshot from Wilson's book. These are the documentation of events from those investigating the claims. As can be seen, the blood only appeared after the investigators left the room. Let's have a look at this one too. As can be seen, once again, those investigating Newman's stigmata had left the room and then came back to fresh blood. According to Wilson, Martini, one of the investigators, states that they never saw any of the wounds bleed, neither from the eyes nor the hands. Only stagnant blood had been seen, and the only time the bleeding took place was when the investigators had left the room. However we look at it, there seems to be something shady going on with the Therese Newman case. Like Wilson says, while Therese Newman cannot be proved a fraud, the investigation does not inspire any degree of confidence in her. There is much more that could be said about the Therese Newman case that would, or at least should, move your belief from a miracle occurred to this is highly dubious. The wiki article is a great place to start, and Wilson's book is another excellent resource. We'll leave this here though, as well as leaving our look at past miracles here. Let's start wrapping this up. In the short video that Capturing Christianity released, his third question asks us atheists how many of the millions of miracle claims throughout history we've examined.
How many of the millions of miracle reports throughout history have you actually deeply investigated?
Well, we clearly haven't looked at millions of miracle claims here. We've only looked at the ones from the Bible and a couple of officially declared miracles found on the Catholic Mission's website. None of them fared very well though. Both the miracle of the sun and the case of Therese Newman were shown to be not miracles at all, at least according to what officially qualifies something as a miracle according to the Catholic Mission's website. Neither of them qualified as the suspension of natural laws, and neither of them could only be explained by God. The miracle of the sun can be explained by natural laws, and is an event that we have seen again since the 1917 event. Well, in the case of Therese Newman, the evidence points towards a deception on the part of Newman and her family. As Wilson says, it can't be proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that there was deception on their part, but all the evidence points towards it being the case. Which leads us back to the first question asked by Capturing Christianity. Should we proportion our beliefs to the evidence?
Do you believe that our beliefs ought to be proportioned to the evidence?
Something I agreed with. Yes, we should proportion our beliefs to the evidence. Cameron explained it as only believing something once we have evidence for it.
So should we only really believe something if we've got evidence in favor of it?
However, as I explained in the last video, proportioning our beliefs to the evidence is something slightly more complicated than that. Using Hume's argument about proportioning beliefs, we saw that it's a case of taking the evidence for and against and weighing them up against each other, and then going with the side that is the strongest. Evidence in this case includes something like our experiences with the world. Well, let's take our experiences into account here. In the case of Therese Newman, we see deception. But it's not the only time that we've seen miracle claims that were actually deceptions. Think of the many faith healers that we have experience with throughout the years. Each of those count as evidence of deception when it comes to miracle claims. Of course, Christians might argue here that they don't count as miracles, so therefore don't count. But they do count as evidence towards the claim that miracles are based on deceptions. Think back to the discussion about evidence in the last video. Something is evidence for some hypothesis if the probability of the truth of the hypothesis is raised when taken together with the evidence. So in this case, all those miracle claims from faith healing count as evidence for the hypothesis that miracles are simple deceptions, as does the case of Therese Newman. The case of the miracle of the sun counts as evidence towards the hypothesis that some things classed as miracles are simply people mistaking rare natural events for supernatural events and suspensions of the laws of nature. Like mentioned, we have models that explain how something like the miracle of the sun can happen naturally, and we have instances of it happening since. So if we are going to proportion our beliefs to the evidence, like Cameron argues we ought to, then the evidence suggests that what we should believe is that miracles are simply mistaken beliefs and deceptions, and people not knowing enough about the laws of nature to know that they haven't been suspended or broken. And let's face it, we have a lot to learn about how nature works, which again counts as evidence towards the hypothesis that it is more likely that we have a gap in our knowledge than the laws of nature have been suspended. See how quickly things get complicated when trying to proportion our beliefs to the evidence. We'll talk about this in greater detail in a future video though. Of course, Christians might argue something about the resurrection here, or some of the other miracles of Jesus. For the sake of argument, let's grant that the resurrection could only be a supernatural event, and could only be explained through supernatural intervention. We could grant all those things, but that still wouldn't really get the argument anywhere. Cameron's argument was that a miracle being reason to believe God exists is contingent on us verifying that an event truly was a miracle.
And again, this is contingent on whether or not we could actually verify that the miracle happened.
Here we're brought back to the discussion about testimony at the beginning of the video, and are talking about the person that jumped 20 feet in the air from a standing position. The resurrection starts from the same position as a claim like this, only the person jumping 20 feet in the air is slightly more believable. There are ways we can conceive of the person jumping so high, but the resurrection not so much. The people telling us about this resurrection aren't like our best friend telling us they saw it either. We know our best friend, know how trustworthy they are, and we can question them about what they saw. There's no such thing when it comes to the writers of the New Testament. At best, the Bible can count as evidence that such an event occurred. Even then, only in the sense that a story passed down over thousands of years about a boy that could jump 20 feet in the air in some remote village in Wales could count as evidence for a person that could jump 20 feet in the air. Only again, even less so because we can conceive of how that could be possible. It is an extraordinary event, but not an event that we consider impossible. In order to verify the event took place, we would need more than the tale passed down through the centuries. What would be needed would be reports from other people and other villages who claim to have seen it happen. And even then, it would need to be numerous reports with a history that we could trace from people whose history we could examine. There is no such thing when it comes to the stories about Jesus' resurrection. Christians here might argue something like there being 500 witnesses to the resurrection, and I've heard them make this very argument. However, we don't actually have 500 witnesses, or at least not in the sense necessary for verification. What we actually have is one person saying that there were 500 witnesses, and no other details. Another argument that Christians make is that the disciples were willing to be tortured and killed because of their belief in the resurrection. And if they didn't really witness the resurrection, then they wouldn't have believed it so firmly and been willing to die for it. Though this seems to be on shaky ground when we consider that many people throughout history have died for false beliefs. Let's just take the case of Ashley Babbitt as an example here. She was killed during the January 6th storming of the Capitol building in the USA. And she was doing it because she falsely believed that the election had been stolen from Donald Trump. Does her being killed and her being willing to die for the cause count as verification that the election was stolen? Does it even count as evidence that the election was stolen? I'd say no. It just counts as her holding on to a false belief very strongly and having motivations that led her to hold that belief so strongly. Anyway, you probably get the point being made here. Whatever case is presented for why we can trust the Bible and why the Bible counts as evidence and verification for the miracles of Jesus, it can be outweighed by the counter-evidence and counter-arguments. We barely even touched on the subject here, and we already have good reason to believe that the Bible does not and cannot count as verification for the events mentioned in the Bible. I'll come back to and build on much of this in a future video, but for now, let's wrap this one up. So in this video, we took a look at some past miracles, or more specifically, we looked at the miracle claims in the Bible along with 2 events officially declared as miracles. What we found was that 2 of the officially declared miracles were not miracles at all. One was a mislabeled natural event, and one was what seemed to be a deception. When we consider the millions of miracle claims throughout history, and the fact that only a tiny percentage of them have been officially declared as miracles, and that a couple of those official miracles weren't miracles at all, the evidence seems to suggest that miracle claims are simply deceptions and false beliefs about nature. And this is about proportioning our beliefs to the evidence. So our belief should be that miracles are deceptions and mistaken beliefs about nature. When it comes to the Bible, we also saw that none of the events in it can actually be verified. We're so far away from the events that we cannot examine them. The writings about them are sketchy at best. And as testimonial accounts, the evidence against them being true far outweighs the evidence for them being true, with none of the evidence ever rising to the strength of verification. And like Cameron said, miracles being reason to believe God exists is contingent on them being verified as miracles. In the next video in this series, I'm going to look at present and future miracles, and focus on the healing waters of Lourdes for examples of present miracles and some hypothetical situations for future miracles. I'll also make an argument for why it is impossible to verify any event as a miracle, building on some of the arguments I made in this video and the previous one. Then in the final part, look at Cameron's final question and discuss that, as well as bring everything together. Thanks for watching and tuning into my channel. I have to admit, I've been enjoying writing these last couple of videos, and hopefully you've enjoyed them too. If you have, then don't forget to hit the like on the video, and maybe even hit subscribe if you haven't already. Both of those things help out a small channel like mine a lot. If you think someone else you know might enjoy this one, then give it a share. I also have a Patreon and PayPal link in the description if you want to show some support and help out a struggling philosophy enthusiast and communicator. I hope life treats you amazingly until the next time. Take care. Bye.